Hi everyone, my name is Micah McLean. I'm the creator of Micah McLean Talks. Today I'm interviewing Marvin Rees, who is best known as the Mayor of Bristol. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment, and I hope you enjoyed this interview. Thank you.
In and of that, I am the first directly elected person of Black African heritage to be mayor of any major European city.
Mhm.
So I've got to deal with the dynamics of being, listen, they'll be true about it, a black man where he's not supposed to be. All right. And that sits on top of city facing major challenges. We have a housing crisis. We have entrenched inequalities. Ronnie Mead said in 2015, Bristol is the worst city in the UK, one of the worst cities to be born black in. Low social mobility. All right. So we've got these existing crises in the middle of all of that contextual difficulty.
Marvin, it's a real pleasure to have you on the platform. You are known as being the first black mayor of Bristol and the last mayor of Bristol, and you're one of the most influential black people in politics. So the first question I'd like to ask you is that you were born in Bristol and you completed both an undergraduate degree and a master's degree and the World Fellows program at Yale University. But what was it that inspired you to run and become Mayor of Bristol?
Well, my run for mayor, there's the kind of the personal life mission element of it, and there's the practicalities of becoming a candidate. So, I'm just doing a book at the moment. It's coming out in August. To be honest, like with all, whenever we put something out there, we're immensely disappointed with it. But because you know what you didn't put in it. But um, I realized during the course of that book that it's my mum's experience and that of my family and my heritage that's really been my driver. If you'd have asked me, even 6 years ago, 5, 6 years ago, I probably would have talked about what it meant to be growing up as a black mixed race kid in Bristol in the 70s and 80s, being chased down the street by people calling me coon and wog and telling me to go back to my own country and other such words. This was normal and being poor at the same time. My mum, working class background, didn't have much money. We were on benefits for a while. I would have talked about that, but it was on a lot of reflection that I realized that a lot of my motivation was actually driven by my mum's experiences of being a white woman with a brown baby in 1972 and the way she was treated and her standing. I mean, I share in the book that when she found out she had me, they advised her to have me aborted. That was like, health advice, health service. Why is that? Now, is that because of my life is deemed worth less as a, half breed kid coming into the world? Probably some of that. But I also reflected on who had the audacity to look my mum in the eye and say, "We don't fit. You think you're fit to be a woman?" Like to speak into someone's life like that. And then what did she feel when someone said to her, "If you were a good woman, you'd give up this child"? And then she kept me, and she's got that framework. Well, maybe because I can't do everything I want to do for the child financially, maybe I'm not a good woman. You know, that rings with me. And then her background, my grandfather's from South Wales, a mining son of a miner, very poor. His mum was an Irish immigrant to South Wales before that, again, a migrant worker. And then on my dad's side, come from Jamaica as a 12-year-old. Landed on the streets of the UK in the 60s. Tough life, have to fight to survive. And then more recently, I was actually in Jamaica with my family, my Jamaican family, as they call them, Jamaican Americans. And my cousin showed me a family tree they've been researching. And I found out that my great, 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 great grandfather, Samuel Richardson, was hung by the British in 1865 for participating in the Morant Bay Rebellion. So my mum's experience and all that bowls over into me, I think. And I'm not in control of it, but also I harness it intentionally. The practicalities of running was Bristol, the UK didn't have mayors really. And then in 2011, there was a referendum and Bristol was the only city to say yes, it wants to have a mayoral system. And an amazing councillor, Margaret Hickman, she said to me, "You should go for mayor." And I hadn't really thought about it, and then I said, "All right, I'll put my name in the ring." Then the train left the station, and I was on it. Got selected. I ran in 12 and lost. Ran in 16 and won.
And just focusing upon your early life, you talked about your experiences with regards to bullying because of your mixed heritage. How did you cope with all of that? Because that sounds quite horrific. Even in, in 2020, people are still experiencing, racism, whatever form that might be. So how did you cope with that?
Oh, you just do. I don't know. How does anyone deal with hardship at any particular point in time? An alternative reality was not an option. So you just acclimatize to it, you know. Give you an example. When I went to the Arctic and when I was young, and we spent like weeks walking around with backpacks. We were only young, so 40, 45 pound was heavy, right? And you walk around with this backpack. And then one day we climbed this mountain, and when we got near the top, um, we took our backpacks off and left them at our camp and continued the final bit of the mountain. Well, we almost jumped up the mountain because we got used to carrying this burden and we didn't know we were carrying it until we put it down. To me, that's like dealing with the world. You just get used to it, right? You constantly triangulating racially. Is that because of them? Because of me? How do they perceive me? Even as mayor, I'm going to call it out. The Green Party have been masters at kind of defining me as physically threatening during my time. I've had 3 letters writing in. I said to a guy, I'm a 6 foot shaved headed 14 stone 10 black guy who used to box and play rugby. I cannot pretend to be 5 foot 6 and 9 stone to make you feel comfortable. If you, so you're constantly triangulating, whether it be kind of overt aggression on the streets, whether it be subtle, undeclared racism in attitudes from white progressives as well, who don't quite trust each other. You just get used to it. And sometimes you don't know that you're triangulating and tackling this stuff until you're in company where you can put all that stuff down and relax, and then you're like, oh, this is what it's like to be, I've said to my wife before, I had an incident and I said to her, wow, is that what it's like to be white? You don't have to triangulate all those things all the time, So
And even following on from that, your resilience is actually incredible because you ran for mayor in 2012 and you originally lost to George Ferguson, but then you went on to win 4 years later. How did you overcome that setback to have a legacy as the mayor of Bristol?
yeah, well, that's all coloured now by the fact I ran again and won. So I probably forget the amount of pain that I experienced in that loss. So if I put it like this, what was going on as I remember it? One is I ran as a Labour candidate. And I ran not because I think the Labour Party is perfect, but because within it, I find a group of people who are most closely aligned to my priorities. Right? No group is perfect. I said to someone, Labour Party, I'm a Christian. I got criticisms of the church and questions of God. You think I'm going to turn up the Labour Party and not have questions and criticisms? I mean, come on, that's normal, right? So I'm in the party. Then we go into the election, and George Ferguson is a white man, privately educated, went to university in the 1960s, resigns from the Lib Dems, runs an independent, and claims to be anti-establishment. And suddenly now I'm the establishment. I'm like, hold on, how the heck did you do this? It's like that game where you switch the tops around and there is ball and you can't find the ball. How did I end up representing this establishment that you came to be fighting against? And there was this kind of coalition of the posh left and the environmental greeny types, and the kind of anti-labor, the disillusioned left, and I'm like, how the heck did I become a lightning rod of privilege that you came to be fighting against? That I am representative of not overturning politics. Lived in a refuge with my white mum in the 1970s, and somehow that annoyed me. And there's an issue with that kind of white left posh progressive world as well. That kind of that went on with that. So that hurt me. And I said to a friend of mine, a filmmaker called Rob Mitchell, I felt like I was mugged of my story. They mugged me. They stole it.
Mhm.
And we see that being repeated, right? From Trump to Farage to Boris Johnson, the poshest people, the most privileged people claiming to be the voice of the marginalized. I tell you, Caroline Lucas, we are political insurgents. No, you're not. You're proper insiders. If you're an outsider, you don't get away with criticizing the establishment. If I did it, I'd be an angry black man in a class full of class envy.
Mhm.
So I dealt with that. That was hard. I also felt embarrassed about losing. I said I went round a shop round the corner from my house, had my hoodie up, I put my hood up. I felt shame. I stood in front of 400 and odd thousand people as a loser. I also felt I let people down, but I also felt that people were saying, get back in your box. So when my name first come forward, a friend, someone I knew was working in the BBC newsroom, and he told me that when it was announced that I was going to run for mayor, I worked at the BBC and it hadn't worked out for me. I was told that a number of the journalists were standing around a table laughing at me, like incredulous that I'd even think I could run because the BBC hadn't worked out for me. And so I felt like they go, "All right, back to normal, get back in your blacks, black boy." They wouldn't have said that in those words, but this is the unsaid culture. So that was all very hard. At the same time, where else do I go? And I know it's everyone's favorite film, but an officer and a gentleman, there's that moment when he won't give up in the training, and the sergeant says to him, "Why don't you quit?" And he says, "I got nowhere else to go."
Mhm.
And that's like me. I didn't feel I had anywhere else to go. I got to stay in it.
Wow. And you were elected for Mayor of Bristol in 2016, and you've held the post for 2 terms. One of the biggest events that happened during your time when you were mayor was the pulling down of Edward Colston's statue. So one thing I'd like to ask you is, during your time as Mayor of Bristol, what were some of the biggest challenges and opportunities you faced while in this role?
Well, the big challenges, I've listed them. So I took over as mayor 6 years into government austerity,
Mhm.
and what's been exposed even recently in the reports, that austerity left us unprepared for COVID. So the disinvestment in local government, the disinvestment in places. Within 2 months of being elected, we had the Brexit vote.
Mhm.
And that's not just a technical vote. That was a culture, conflict, and wars that went along with that.
Mhm.
When I was first elected, the Conservative Party, I remember them describing me as an inner city mayor. Right?
Mhm.
We know what that means, right? It's code, right?
Mhm.
Um, so we had that. Then we moved into the pandemic era. And from there into war in Ukraine, cost of living crisis, and culture wars. And that happens within the context of a growing environmental, ecological emergency,
Yeah.
and the migration crisis that's happening along with that, with millions of people being driven out of their villages, towns, cities, countries of origin by climate change. Right.
Mhm.
So we're dealing with that. Now, in and of that, I am the first directly elected person of Black African heritage to be mayor of any major European city.
Mhm.
So I've got to deal with the dynamics of being, listen, they'll be true about it, a black man where he's not supposed to be. All right. And that sits on top of city facing major challenges. We have a housing crisis. We have entrenched inequalities. Ronnie Mead said in 2015, Bristol is the worst city in the UK, one of the worst cities to be born black in. Low social mobility. Right. So we've got these existing crises in the middle of all of that contextual difficulty. So those were really and fewer resources to tackle them as an authority.
And following on from that, in 2020, Edward Colston's statue was pulled down during the Black Lives Matter protests. In your opinion, is it ever acceptable to destroy statues of historical figures, regardless of how controversial they may be?
So I just have to be careful. They didn't destroy the statue; they just pulled it down.
Yeah.
And we've actually taken the statue now and put it in the museum as part of an exhibition into protest. It's not the first time statues have been pulled down in the UK. It happened a couple of 100 years ago as well. So it's part of our story there. So I'm going to say this: what I said at the time. I am descended from enslaved Africans, right? And that's my heritage, as I shared earlier on. And I live with the legacy of that as well, both in terms of international inequality, the racism that was developed to justify slavery and all the rest of it. So, do I want a statue of a slaver up who was involved in the kidnapping of 80,000 African people? No. He may well have owned one of my ancestors. All right. I don't want it up. But I'm also the directly elected mayor of Bristol. I can't condone people going out on the streets and pulling statues down. That's lawlessness. I can't. I'm a politician.
Mhm.
So those two things, are true at the same time and difficult to hold together. But nonetheless, I have to hold them together. I have to advocate for order. In the city. So I would advocate for orderly ways of going about it. But at the same time, I'm frustrated with people who say this is changing, history. Statues don't tell us stories about the past. They tell us who we celebrate and who we revere. Statues are honorable. They're moments of honor. If I said I was going to put a statue up, they'd say I'm trying to honor myself, not try and tell my story. Right. So, there's a lot of poverty in the language in the debate around statues. It's not an informed debate. It's too emotional. I'd say. And actually, generally the statues are rich white men. I mean, the kind of the thing of the reach out to the working class, which is my history, by the way. White working class is my history. I'm not giving that. um, that appeal is a false appeal. It's like Nigel Farage's ability to reach out to the white working class. It's not real. He's a seducer.
And following on from that, The Guardian reported that Edward Colston's statue was placed in a quiet corner of Bristol's Waterside Museum. What are your thoughts on this?
I don't know why they use the word quiet. It's a museum. It is quiet. Well, it's no more quiet than any other corner of that museum. I mean, it's just when you get into it. The number of times I've been frustrated with journalism, they have to, you know, and I worked in a newsroom. It's like you claim to be wordsmiths and understand the power of language. In the end, when you're challenged on the loose use of language, you go, oh, it's just a word. No, it's not. You've used that word to say that we're kind of trying to silence it off. We celebrate what we've done with that statue because we think we did a very good job at handling the hauling down of the statue, taking it and then put it into context. So around that statue, there's a history of protest in Bristol. Right around it, there's information about all protests, including the bus boycott. The impact it had on race relations there. It includes quotes around that statue that include different perspectives on it. I'm quoted on it. My quote actually is, I'd say, I'm not saying it's worth looking at, but yeah, because actually one of the things I point out, by the way, is 4 white people pulled the statue down.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell you what, and Asher, my deputy mayor Asher Towan, they spent their defence basically saying me and Asher, first 2 black politicians of our rank in Europe, didn't do anything for black people, didn't do anything on racism. I was like, hold on, you got 4 white people trying to defend yourself, slagging off black leaders. And how would you know what we've done? In fact, we've done lots on race, right? You just don't know about it, and because it doesn't impact on you. It's just all gesture politics. And I pointed out one of the questions I said was for you claim this is on the front end of tackling racism. Would 4 black people have pulled the statue down on camera in front of police and then asked for a Crown Court trial? I'm not saying that I'm not judging you on that. I'm saying that maybe one of the layers we can pull back on this and expose is that was even an operation in white privilege. You got the boldness to just do this in front of police on camera and then go to court and say the statue offended me. Would we as black people have as much confidence in the criminal justice system, our ability to bend it to our desires and our emotions? No. I'm not saying that makes them bad. I'm just saying we've got to look at the layers on, the layers on this thing. So yeah, it was an incredibly interesting time. But I think we held the city together well. I think one of the things I said at the beginning was when we get to the end of this era, and there's a truth, isn't it? This too shall pass, right? Everything comes to an end. This is a city in which we all must continue living together. So what we can't have is we got to come up with a way of doing things that means that if you get what you wanted, the city's respected you, right? If you didn't get what you wanted, the city respected you, and if you actually given what you didn't want, the city's respected you. So there's a process of respect that creates space for us all to continue living together, even if in this moment in time the outcome wasn't one that we wanted. And we worked hard to do that because we couldn't come forward having put dividing lines, conflict lines in the country. We're not Trump. We're not Farage. We're not doing our leadership like that. We're going to offer some nuance while making it clear, my personal opinion, that I don't want a statue of a slave up in the middle of the city.
Thank you for sharing that. And following on from that, focusing upon black people and leadership, Vaughan Gething resigned as First Minister of Wales. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm really disturbed by that. One is I really celebrated Vaughan's ascendancy to First Minister of Wales. I think it was an amazing achievement, and it was a point of pride. And I did actually have a quick chat with him. But I've been disturbed at the way the commentary has followed it actually. And I did a Times Radio interview the other day. I was actually being interviewed on devolution, but the person before me was a journalist from Wales Online talking about Vaughan. And the opening of the interview went like this. And we have to be careful the way we talk about this stuff, right? Again, as I mentioned earlier on, the only people that can criticize the establishment are members of the establishment. Anyone else does it, it got red lines. So if I talk about race, it has a whole different level of sting in it and repercussions for me, right? Than if a white progressive does it, you know? So, but I'm going to talk about it. So the interviewer said he didn't seem very contrite. Contrite. So I'm like, okay, that's a small door, but it leads me into a big room, right, of dynamics. And then the journalist said, that's probably been the problem from the very beginning. Now you're like, you've said one thing, but now you said another. When you've got 2 points, you've got a direction. You know, I put 1 point in the ground, I put another one in. I draw a ruler line, it takes me somewhere, right? That's a problem. Because those of us who are familiar with issues of racism, and again, I referenced earlier on the feeling that people need me to be physically smaller and less significant. Why would you become the leader of a nation and then be contrite? You're the leader of a nation. You're leading that nation on the national stage, international stage. You don't expect Trump or Biden. You know, in fact, you want robustness from your leaders. Obviously, contrition from. You know, why is that the quality that was missing in this man? That's a real problem. And let's take it back. Lower your eyes, right? Step off the sidewalk. But let me take you back to 1863, an essay by Frederick Douglass, right? Abolitionist, escape slavery. Frederick Douglass wrote an essay called On Prejudice. I think that's the title of it. I'll never forgot it. And in the essay, he said, white people have never had a problem with physical proximity to black people, right? You think about it. They raped them, right? They had them wet nurse their babies, right? They had them in the house. And what Frederick Douglass said is they had them as like servants and they'd be dressed better than the poorest white people. So they don't have a problem with physical proximity to black people. What they had a problem with is the black people who look them in the eye as equals, right? So that when you start talking about, I need you to show contrition or a bit more humility, to me, I'm not saying you're orchestrating this, but I hear echoes from that, and that's a big problem. And I think, secondly, one of the criticisms was he never managed to win the support of his party, and he never managed to win the support of the Senate. Well, that doesn't mean he's a problem. Let's throw it in and let's just test it to make sure it is not an issue. It is possible that the reason he struggled to get the loyalty is because he's a black man. I'm not saying that is the case, but you can't not discuss that until you've proven that's not the case. So the journalists have come on, and I've heard them on news agents, whatever, talking as though race doesn't exist. They're just not even talking about it. That's a real problem. And I think also it's a reflection of the fact that newsrooms, journalism is not race and class inclusive. So they don't ask these questions. They don't have these perspectives and these understandings, of the world. And if they do venture to raise it, it's pretty ham-fisted and blunt. Like too often they think racism comes along with big boots and skinheads, right? It was Martin Luther King that said, it's the white liberal who's more devoted to order than justice that is more of a problem than the Ku Klux Klan, right? And the same as Malcolm X, at least in the South, they're honest with me, right? So I have some real problems with what's happened around Vaughan.
It's really interesting you say that, because I just think of it even in the more mainstream context. So when, for example, the England team lost, you'd always see Saka on the front pages. And whenever the England team won, you tend to see someone like Harry Kane or Phil Foden. And it's just that negative stereotype of our people, of black culture, that if something goes badly, there's always some kind of a blame game. But if something goes well, sometimes we're not even recognized. So I find that dynamic really interesting.
I mean, I know it's been done on many fronts, but I do think there would be, the time was always right to run an analysis on our journalistic coverage, because it's so critical to the functioning of our democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I was just listening to an interview with Jon Stewart, actually, who I'm a big fan of, the kind of American comedian who does Daily Show. And one of the things that he was saying, actually, we've placed a heavy burden on the media to be the guardians of our democracy, right? And it's true, right? We expect them to be able to come up with the analysis and a framework for testing politics, and actually, it's proven too much.
Mm-hmm.
You'd expect a rational, evidence-based argument around Brexit, and we still get Brexit, even though that goes against common sense. Like I said, I often say it was the wrong answer to the right problem. The right problem was that globalization and so forth has been leaving people behind and leaving them disillusioned and vulnerable. But problem is, Brexit wasn't going to solve that. Right? I'm not saying the EU was a wonderful institution. Lots of problems with the EU. So it's very hard to sell an imperfect status quo when people are just saying, "Well, we might just roll the dice and give it a go." But yeah, one of the problems I think with the media is that increasingly it's competing with Twitter and social media, and it has to sell advertising, so it has to generate clicks. And we need to be honest about the fact that that a lot of the business model around a lot of our journalism is about generating business and traffic, and so it has to move to the sensational. Obama wrote about this in another way in his book Audacity of Hope. He said they don't focus on truth, they focus on conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And conflict is the story, not accuracy, whether someone's accurate or not. And that's a problem.
Yeah. And even following on from that, in 2023, you were awarded an OBE for your services to local government. During your time as mayor, what are some of your proudest achievements?
So there's the open fate, like open ones, and then there's the cut. So if I was to choose three, and then I'll probably regret just choosing just three afterwards. One is that we built tens of thousands, we built 14,500 houses. So that'd be number one. Homes are critical to public health, race equality, climate change. House building is big. I'd say, secondly, I think the impact we had on the international stage has been huge, on the migration crisis, climate change, and making the case for cities to be part of global governance. We've been very prominent at that. And the third is that we left Bristol with a long-term plan. We wrote a plan for 20, I didn't write it. We created a space for the city to come together and write it. And despite all their criticisms, the new political leadership in Bristol has just taken that plan on, and our whole approach to city governance. Like, it's not even changed it. So that's transcended the electoral cycle. So despite all the criticisms, they must have liked what we were doing. And if I can just add, so those are the three deliverables, but there's some subtle stuff as well. I've had people come in my office. I had a young man in my office tagged, perpetrator stroke victim of knife crime, life under threat. Sat in my office and we talked like equals. You know, my deputy mayor Asher on the way out gave him a big hug. 17-year-old. But I said to him, "You're just a child. You could be my child." He said, "Yeah, that's right." But outside he's a threat. That means a lot to me that we can do that. There's a young woman came in the other day, and I know that she happened to be in front of some very senior British politicians and some dignitaries, and it was fed back to me that she told them that she was lost in life. She'd lost her older brother to suicide, and young black girl from St. Paul's in Bristol. But she didn't think black people could do anything until I was there. And then I met her, I know her, I talked to her with respect, I talked to her like an equal, and now she's inspired. She said these people. That means a lot to me. And my friend Poku, he said that his young daughter said, "Oh, Daddy, the mayor looks like you." And he said to me, "Marvin, you don't know, that's really significant that my daughter looks at political leadership in the city, the highest political leadership, and it looks like us." So Poku is like pure Ghanaian. He doesn't look like me at all. But then the point is, we're all black, and I've stepped into a space. And when I was young, black leadership was never the norm. By the time I come to the end, the mayor of Bristol can look like me, shaved head, black guy, right? Goes to the gym, likes a bit of boxing. That's important.
And even following on from that, outside of politics, you are a committed Christian. So how does your faith impact your politics?
Yeah, that's an interesting journey for me recently, because I will say that it's been a challenge. Just my connectivity to the church, to the extent the church includes American Christians,
Mhm.
to be
Mhm.
honest, American white evangelicals, right
Mhm.
wing. That I mean, my faith has always been a part of it. Growing up, God, there's a passage, isn't it? God takes the foolish to overcome the wise, the weak to overcome the strong, the things that are not to shame the things that are. I was a nothing, right? I'm half breed, as people call me when I was little. No race. I'm poor, so I don't exist in that sense. Single parent, lived in a refuge. I'm a nothing of the world, you know? And I've come to be someone that's been involved in setting agendas, right? My faith has been a huge part of that, right? And I want that for other people too, right? And that's where my heart goes. So it's always my two favorite biblical, well, not favorite, but two biblical stories that reach my soul are these, right? One, the woman caught in adultery, when the religious leaders bring her to judge her and shame her. And Jesus shames them, sends them away. And then he says to her, "Where are your accusers?" She says, "They've all left." He says, "Neither do I accuse you. Go sin no more." That's love, man. That to me, that makes my spirit warm. The second one is Jesus in the temple.
Mhm.
He goes in and he overturns the tables and the chairs of those who are exploiting the poor, and the zeal of God is on him. And then what does it say, the very next passage in one of their accounts? Because it's in four gospels. It says, so you've got this rage. He goes away, makes a whip, drives out the exploiters. And then he says, the blind and the lame came to him and he healed them. Think of that change of pace. So that rage against the exploitative structures of establishment, taking advantage of people with the compassion, that's what I've needed my whole life. And that's my fuel. What I would say is, I think one of the biggest anti-testimonies to who Jesus was is what's going on in the church. I said to the leader of an American church the other day, at what point is our understanding, engagement with, and application of God so different? We have to admit it's a different religion. Because I don't see, I look at the great evils of US history and world history, actually, and rarely could they have happened without the church. Either turning a blind eye, uh, theologically justifying it after the fact, or actively driving it. And I'm just seeing stuff I think is incredibly problematic in the United States being driven by church people who would claim to be my fellow faith holders, and that's really divisive. Now, I get that, but listen, I'm just being real. I struggle with that at the moment.
And do you ever find that there's a conflict between your faith-based convictions and your work as a politician? Have you ever been conflicted between the two?
No, because I said to some young Christians before, I used to be in this kind of, I'm not going to compromise, never compromise. Listen, people who don't compromise don't do anything.
Hmm.
Make yourself dirty. What I said to someone the other day, they said Obama, this, that, and the other. I said, what? So Obama compromised. What? So he's supposed to turn up at the end of 8 years and say to a young black boy in Chicago, "Hey, listen, I know you didn't get your liver replacement because I wasn't able to get the deal done, but I just want you to know that ideologically I'm pure."
Hmm.
No, no. Get dirty, compromise yourself, and get me something. And so that's what I think you got to do. Yeah, again, let's take the Bible. There's a parable, right? That
Hmm.
the talents. One person goes and buries his talent because he's scared he might lose it. Who
Hmm.
gets rewarded? The one who puts their talents in play, invests, and takes a risk. I take a risk getting involved in politics, but it's a risk to get stuff done. And at the end of my time, when I stand before God, I would prefer him to say, look, your theology was about 10% out, and I wish you didn't make that compromise, but I can see you did it so that child had food and
Hmm.
that family had a home, right? Turning up and saying, yeah, my theology is 100% spot on and I never compromise. I say, well, what did you achieve? Oh, I didn't achieve anything. Well, that's the ultimate act of selfishness, right?
Hmm.
Not even to take a risk that you will sully yourself so you can stay pure. I'm not into that. So no, to me, being engaged in politics is what it's about.
Hmm. Thank you. And following on from this, what skill must any person have if they want to become a mayor of a major city?
Oh, um, so there was no one template for being mayor, right? Um, lots of different kinds of mayors, but I would point to a few things. If I pick out three, I like my list in threes, right? Trinity number, isn't it, right? One is you have to deal with complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And complexity means a recognition that you don't get outcomes by working with one set of tools alone. So you don't shape a city simply by working with your local government. You have to be able to recognize that a place is made up of government, universities, private sector, voluntary sector. And in that complexity, you have to be able to work with all those people and get them to work together, right? So work with that complexity. The second element of complexity is this. You have to realize that in a complex world, good things can have negative consequences for some people. All right. Clean air zones are classic. It's a good thing to put a clean air zone, cleans up the air. That doesn't mean it won't financially hinder people. Now, the fact that there are some negative consequences don't mean you don't do it, but you have to know it's going to happen and try and mitigate that. So you have to be able to deal in that world, right? A good thing is going to have negative consequences. Every solution has a price to be paid. All right. Someone pays a price for every solution, not just financial price, impact on our lifestyle. Again, you have to be able to appreciate that, and deal with that. And everything has a trade-off. Action has a consequence. So does inaction. Living in that space. Um, so that's the other skill I'd say is to be able to navigate that. My third skill is I think you have to be able to look over the long term. This is not just about getting a couple of photos for your next campaign in 2, 3, 4 years. Mayors need to plan for decades ahead, do their best. And I think that's what we've done with Bristol's One City Plan.
Thank you. And you have spoken on climate change at TEDx and also the Yale World Fellows event. Why are you so passionate about climate change?
Well, a whole bunch of reasons. Give me a list of three again. All right. One is because we're responsible for the planet. and I and I and I think this is an amazing world. As a human being, as a Christian too. So we should take care of it. Secondly, as I said to some of the environmentalists, I mean, it took a while for some of the kind of hipstery, white, green party kind of environmentalists to accept me as someone who cared about the planet. And I remember someone from Extinction Rebellion saying, "We just don't think you really care." I said, "Listen, the people who get hit first and hardest by climate change look like my dad and me. They don't look like you. So how do you think I don't care about this, right? It's my heritage people that are being killed and displaced by this thing. Of course, I want to do it. You can't tackle racism unless you're thinking about climate change. So it's inherent to social justice, right? Um, the third reason, I think there's massive opportunity in it as well.
Mhm.
Actually, it's not a cost. It's a massive business opportunity in retrofitting homes, investing in renewables, the energy resilience that comes from renewables, and actually reducing the negative consequences that come from climate change. If climate change is driving global migration, that comes at a cost to those individuals and to receiving countries. Then actually, by tackling climate change, you can reduce those costs that result from human disruption. And that's a massive opportunity for the planet and whoever can solve it.
Thank you. And it's actually interesting because in this year's election, there were many young people that ran to become an MP and they actually ended up becoming MPs as well, a good number. Why do you think more and more young people are becoming interested in politics?
Well, I think that's a conflicting story. I mean, some are because they're stepping up, and I really appreciate that. But there's also data to show that fewer people actually have a strong commitment to democratic institutions, and the younger you get, the younger people have the least commitment. I was in Barcelona not too long ago speaking on an event about cities and democracy, and the research coming out of the German Marshall Fund was only 41% of Europeans have a strong commitment to democratic institutions. We can see that with the rise of the right, right, and reactionary populism, reform and all that, and stuff in Germany and France. So it's a concern, a real concern. Um, so I don't know why. I mean, I wouldn't want to say why, other than the stakes are high, and so it's driving people to step up a bit. I would like to see voting age come down to engage people in those processes sooner. Voting age down to 16. I'd love to see that. Um, but listen, I mean, it takes active engagement. Sometimes people think that I think the default is we think the world is fundamentally good and going in the right direction. And then every now and again, bad people or bad things pop up and try to steer it away from that. I think we need to grapple with the possibility that the opposite is true, that fundamentally the world moves towards chaos, disorder, oppression, inequality, and brutality. And the only thing that keeps it from going down that path is that good people every day are pushing it into a form that produces some elements of justice and fairness and inclusion and saving the planet. I'm not saying that is. I'm not kind of this doom monger saying that is the way it is. I'm just saying we need to entertain the possibility that it is. In fact, Martin Luther King said some people think that they're lazy. They think that time in and of itself makes the world better. He says people of ill will have been much more effective at using time than people of goodwill.
I can believe that. And you are one of the most influential black people in the UK. And when I mean influential, you've been listed on the power list. So for members of my audience that don't know what that is, the likes of Lewis Hamilton, Sterling, and others have been mentioned on that list. Why do you think representation is so important in raising the aspirations of black people?
Well, we need to see ourselves in power. Like just I said with my friend's daughter, and the young woman, young man, we need to see ourselves there, right? Because it makes it possible. I tell you, when I went to my first mayoral hustings, I had to take a really deep breath. I was in the basement of a really good Bristol law firm, actually. I give them props, Burgess Salmon, they hosted this hustings. And I was on stage in 2012. I'd just come back from Yale. I was known amongst the voluntary sector, but as I said, I know that some of the journalists have been laughing at the prospect of me running for mayor. And I was on stage. How old would I have been at the time? I would have been 40. I'd already shaved my head by then. I was like similar physique. I like to think I'm holding on to my physique. So I looked the same shape. And next to me, I had like three white men in their 60s and 70s, a retired GP, a retired accountant, and a semi-retired architect. And as I sat on stage in this room, a couple of hundred people in there, there were three people in the room that weren't white. One was me and one was my mum's friend, right? The other one I didn't know. And I was on stage and I looked at the audience. I thought, no, this is 2012, by the way, before I was elected. I thought no one is looking at me and thinking, oh, he looks like the mayor. Now that's probably me projecting, right? But I'm not projecting without any lived experience, without any evidence. So one is we need to be able to see ourselves there because it opens up the pathway. I think two, actually, is not just for our own people, it's for other people. I went out for lunch with I'm going to describe it like this: a rich old white guy from Bristol's establishment, totally authentic guy, good man, really good man. And he said to me, Marvin, I have never voted Labour in my life, but I shall be voting for you in the next election. I use his words because I wouldn't say that. I shall be voting for you. This is a die-in-the-wall conservative, member of Bristol's establishment. And I would suggest that because of what we've managed to achieve, there's a lot of demystification around black leadership and what it can be and how successful it can be. That's important too, right? I'm not saying we've solved it, but I'm saying it's a dynamic. The third thing I would say, my list of three again, is that policy is important, but representation matters too. What we don't want is well-meaning people coming out and finding out what black people think and then going back and feeding it back, writing it down and feeding it back. We need to be in those institutions so that within the very DNA of those decision-making institutions, our understanding, our insights, our perspectives are there. Again, think of the way the framework that I've heard, by the way. I mean, maybe I would have missed something, no doubt, but the framework through which people are interpreting what's happened to Vaughan in Wales. I haven't heard any meaningful analysis of the black man. I didn't hear anyone say, oh, it's a bit problematic if you start talking about you need them to show some degree of deference or a bit more humility. There's a problem with that. That conversation clearly not happen because they're broadcasting it. So if we're not in those institutions don't think like us. They don't see the world like us. They don't understand us. And that's about race. That's about class. It's about poverty too. It's about women. It's about disabled people, gay people. You know,
Mhm.
we all need to be in there. So those mix of worldviews. And by the way, that's not just about social justice. The evidence tells us that if you're getting access to a diversity of thought, you will have greater collective intelligence.
Mhm.
Organizations that do not access diversity of thought are less intelligent than they would otherwise be. They may well get away with it because they're big. BBC's like that, right?
Mhm.
Gets away with it because it's a huge organization. Government get away, but never question, never doubt that there's a degree of creativity, innovation, efficiency, effectiveness that's been lost because we're not accessing diversity of thought.
Mhm. Thank you. And one thing that's exciting is that you have your autobiography coming out, My City. So, what was the inspiration behind writing this book?
Well, it's going to be called um, Last Mayor of Bristol. Let's see what happens. Last Mayor of Bristol, self-evident. Let's see what happens. By the way, when you talk about resilience, I discovered, and I didn't do it on purpose, that is a phrase I've used since I was a teenager. So a number of times people have said, no, you can't do it. It's not for you. Don't do that. And then I've generally whispered to myself, well, let's see what happens. When I first expressed an interest in the Royal Marines, my school teacher, one of my teachers, kind of laughed at me. And I did say to myself, let's see what happens. When I first went for mayor, someone said to me, no one's going to vote for you. And I said to myself, well, let's see what happens. And I didn't know I did it, and then I realized I did it, and it's a little thing. So let's see what happens now. I didn't get selected. I put myself forward to become a Labour candidate twice. Labour Party, I'm not what they're looking for right now to be an MP. I thought that was where I was going to go. So I'm saying it actually is a really real moment for me. Let's see what happens.
Mhm.
You know. But yeah, and the inspiration. I mean, people ask me to tell my story quite a lot. Um, and then someone come along, I got an agent, and someone come and said, "Yeah, we'd like to do the book, so let's do it." So we did it. Listen, mate, the truth is, with all these things, we're never totally happy with it, right? I'm
Mhm.
like, oh God, this book, it's not good. You know, maybe I'll get the chance to do a second edition where I can actually layer over it again. But it'll be all right. It tells my story, and talks a little bit about what it's like to be mayor. Not everything, but it talks a lot about what it was like.
And just quickly, now that you've ended your tenure as Mayor of Bristol, what are your hopes for the future? What do you plan to do?
For me personally, or for the city?
So, for you personally.
Me. Oh. So look, this is the way I put it, right? Well, as mayor, I think some people see the world through their own eyes and
Mhm.
they can't understand any other framework to it. So some people say, oh, Marvin's a career politician. All he's ever wanted to do was be mayor. Well, that's not true because we only got a mayor in 2012. So that's just demonstrably untrue.
Mhm.
But secondly, I didn't while I was in it, I occupied it fully, right? Being a mayor was just another expression of what I've always wanted to do. I talked about Jesus in the temple and the woman caught in adultery. Straight out of university, I joined Tear Fund, a development charity. Then I went to work in Washington, D.C. for a social justice organization. Then I went and studied economic development, worked for a guy who worked a lot on social justice in the United States. When I went to work for the BBC, I really wanted to bring a voice to the voiceless. So I looked at what was going on in our Black communities. I wanted to work internationally, war zones, and all the rest of it. Right. I just wanted to bring people's voices out. I wanted to change the world. I wanted to make it better and fairer. So the mayoral chapter of my life has now ended. That's now in the rearview mirror. I'm fine. I'm going to try and find other ways to do what I've always wanted to do, and just try to do my bit to make the world fairer. It's not an arrogant statement. It's just what I've wanted to do. I don't know any other way of describing it, really.
Thank you so much, Marvin. The last question is, please tell us about any other projects you'll be working on this year.
Yeah, so I'll be working with mayors around the world on migration crisis. A lot of the agreements on migration are negotiated between national governments. A lot of the framework is set between national governments. I think cities and mayors have a different perspective on migration. Think about it, right? National governments talk about stopping people moving. That's what they do. Let's put the borders up. Why do cities exist? Cities exist because stuff moves. right? And where you get a flow of people this direction and maybe a flow of people that direction, what would you get at that intersection?
Mhm.
You get the build-up of city, right? Now that could be a port, it could be a crossroads on the rail line. That's why we exist. Cities exist because stuff moves. The moment you stop stuff moving, cities begin to die.
Mhm.
They may not look like it straight away, but they will die. So I'm trying to bring that perspective to cities, and make sure that's influencing the board. Second area I'm working on is climate finance. She's now the co-leader of the Green Party. She's in Parliament. Brought a motion to Bristol, said, Marvin, you got to declare a climate emergency. First off, I want you to come back with a plan in 6 months. Well, so we did. Well, we were going to do it anyway, but yeah, thanks for your contribution to that. Secondly, they said all you need is political will. I hate this phrase. I think I'm distinguished between my feelings towards the person and that kind of opportunistic part. The Greens do this a lot. If you don't do it, it's just because you didn't have the political will. No, to decarbonize Bristol's economy takes political will and about £16 billion, right?
Mhm.
No one retrofits a home unless they're being paid. No one puts a heat network in unless they're paid. You got to have a project manager to manage it all. You got to have someone to manage the flow of money and investment. That all takes lots and lots of money. So I've been involved in work with mayors around the world about how we create the conditions in which mayors and cities access the money that's out there. So these are my two kind of priority areas. And being a good dad and husband and son, brother. I've got my family still here.
Thank you so much, Marvin, for coming on the platform. It's been a real pleasure to learn from your life experiences. It's been a very insightful interview. So thank you so much for coming on.